So we'll end with a brief discussion about the labor supply over the worker's life cycle. So far I have mentioned a couple times about workers in retirement or teenagers, people at different points in their life, but we really only considered a single point in time in our model. And now we want to fully consider how employment decisions change over a worker's life. For instance, workers can trade some leisure today for consumption and then allow themselves to enjoy that leisure later. If you think of this program as a part of your work, part of your job training, then you're doing this right now, sacrificing a lot of time that you could be spent enjoying leisure on doing something related to work. Now, typically, we don't consider education as part of the working decision because, unlike many of you, typically the worker leaves the labor market or significantly reduces their employment to do so. So I think for many of you, when you were an undergrad, you weren't working full time or you're working, just a small part-time job to make some cash while you're in college, but you're not truly, engaging in your career. We tend to say the wages follow an upside down U or a hump-shaped distribution over the worker's life cycle. So they start low, high schoolers or college kids working part-time jobs after school, and then entry-level workers receiving low wages. Over time, these workers get promoted and they develop human capital, end up resulting in increased earnings. These increased earnings tend to stabilize by about 50 or so, and eventually they begin to decline as many workers cut back their hours and begin to retire or work part-time. So here we can see this graphically, so you don't have to just imagine it. On the left here, we have the earnings shown as the wage rate across the worker's life cycle. Now, the second one here shows something a little bit different. It's the hours of work across the life cycle. Now, this is going to be slightly different. You see, it's not quite as low here in the early years like the wage rate is, but it follows the same basic pattern. What's important to note here is that the price of leisure, or what the individual is giving up to enjoy an hour of leisure, is relatively less costly for both younger workers down here and for older workers over there. In this case, it's because their lower wages mean that they're giving up less for leisure. And the highest wages come in the middle, right here, at this point in their life. These middle-aged workers are working the most, and honestly, leisure is relatively more costly because of their higher earnings potential and their wage rates, and because of, thinking for the future of not wanting to work when they're 60, 70, 80, 90, going through the rest of their life. So what we tend to see is these middle-aged workers working the most and sacrificing their leisure time at this point so they can spend more time on leisure later. We call this the intertemporal substitution hypothesis. I know, difficult words, basically saying that over time, so intertemporal means over time, so over a person's life cycle, they substitute their leisure in order to take advantages of the price. So it's relatively more cheap here for leisure, relatively more cheap here, relatively more expensive here. So they're going to substitute over time, engaging in more leisure down here when it's cheaper, working when it's relatively more expensive to engage in leisure, and then again, engaging in more leisure where it's relatively cheaper. But while the general trend is the same across workers, workers that earn different wages will experience different levels of changes throughout their life cycle. So here we have an example of two different workers earning very different wages. Out here, Joe out-earns Jack with a much higher wage rate. But if we go over to the hours of work, we're not exactly sure what this is going to mean for how many hours Joe chooses to work. So if the substitution effect dominates, Joe is going to end up working quite a bit more because Joe can earn a lot more money. It's relatively more expensive for him to engage in leisure, so he does that. On the other hand, Joe might work a lot less if the income effect dominates. In this case, he's going to work fewer hours because leisure is a normal good, so he can now engage in more consumption just because of the increase in wages that he's getting, and he can allocate more time towards leisure as well. Now, the life cycle earnings pattern doesn't only affect the hours worked, it also affects the decision to work or not. So we can see the same pattern emerging for the labor force participation rate over the lifetime. Some people are young, down here in high school and college, they're much less likely to work. And you see the same thing happening as they get older. They begin to retire and exit the labor force. At this For these people, both the young and the relatively old, leisure is less costly in this period in their life, so they're far more willing to leave the labor force to engage in that leisure. But prime age workers, up here, we're talking 25 to 55, are much more likely to participate in the labor force. Now, this brings us to the end of chapter 2. There's some discussion in your textbook about testing whether the models we use that we've talked about so far hold up with empirical evidence. I'm going to skip that part, and that's not necessary for you to read because there's quite a bit of empirical work that we're not going to be working with. I don't want you to take away, learning about regressions and fixed effects models and things like that. That's totally unnecessary for what this course is meant to do for you. There are a few smaller topics and examples in the text that I didn't cover in this lecture. I do encourage you to read those, as they're going to help with your understanding of concepts and with the assignments. With that, I'll be ending the lecture for chapter 2. If you have any questions as you're working through the assignments, again, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to help.